This is log number 16. Um, the past week I have been working towards finishing the design. It has been going well. Supposedly I was going to finish it by today, which is the 9th of February, which is a Friday. I didn't quite finish it. I have a little bit left, but I've taken some time to reflect a lot as I was sort of finalizing the design. At some point towards the middle of this week, I took off all the other designs and placed them next to each other and I started reflecting on them. I started seeing them, firstly, to my surprise, to the skill level differences. Obviously, the first design that I've done was back in November, and now we're in February, where the third design is almost completed. There is a very distinct, I would say, at least for me, skill level difference. And I have mentioned before in the previous logs how I wanted the skill difference on the statues and such to be somewhat obvious, given that if imagine a few months ago and I improved. Imagine this stonemason who was living in this tower for many decades, and every statue wasn't conceived in the same day, but there was decades and years between each. And I started reflected on that. I started reflecting on how would that appear, right? Like I see the visual differences in terms of skill. How would I bridge the gap? And one thing that I sort of came down was that the environment, given that it's warm, time has passed and such, should pretty much stay on part and quite identical in terms of scale. So I might need to go over some of the tiles, objects around, and in truth, I will do that. But when reflected on the statues, I quite welcome the idea of it being visibly better, sort of like this new statue, which in my mind it was done later and not earlier in his career. And as I mentioned before, again, there's like this fine line between, okay, you were a youngster, you were doing your statues and they were okay, but then when you got more knowledge, you became better. But then when you became older, you became less attentive to details. You didn't care about them. You cared about sort of the thing that you only saw, and perfectionism was thrown out the window, and all these sort of different conceptual sort of, yes, time would improve things, but at the same time, a lot of time would destroy the direction of someone's intent. And I've been trying to reflect on that. I've been trying to reflect this week as I was drawing, and like if if my previous paintings were in a room constantly being displayed, and I keep having this conversation in my head of like, how would I feel? Now, I know for a fact that if for me, seeing my work on display constantly, I detest that. I begin sort of limiting myself with the past by, okay, I've done this, so I'm capable of doing this, but at the same time, what if I cannot achieve this anymore? What if I do something else and is not on part, or the blending is not as equal, and things of that nature that reflect sort of insecurities. And having them on display and just seeing that constantly will probably make me destroy them, which it's something that I've done in my earlier sort of when I was studying art. I remember in my college years there was a time that we had to do a lot of sketchbooks, and it was this graphic designs course, and every page of the sketchbook would reflect sort of these new artists that we found, this new sort of technique, and so on and so forth. I was enjoying it at the time, and I remember towards the end of that, having rearranged my new space, I had a lot of empty space on the wall. And, I said, I might as well construct my sketchbook and sort of mount it on the wall and just have it on display and see my accomplishments back in the day when I was 17, I think. And I enjoyed it the first day, having to rearrange everything. And through the days as I was there and I was living my life, and hurdles came in the way, and new art projects came into work. So I would constantly sort of like cut myself, look upon that wall, and just feel sort of remorse, feel sort of like this disdain. And I began sort of wondering why. And I honestly thought that, given that I was always limiting myself by seeing the past, I wasn't proud of it. I wasn't there's never really a time where I would see my work and say, "Hey man, I did this. Wow." Only the understanding, like, I actually did it, but not visually see it. Like, if I were to explain it a bit better, flow, for example. The paintings are okay, like, I don't really care, but the outcome on how I put everything together, the words, the music, the visual of that catalog that I made, I'm proud of that. I'm proud of sort of that as a display, sort of the combination of everything that I've learned, rather than just the painting. The painting alone, I see it and I'm like, oh, I could have done this better. I could have done that better. I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have done that. I might as well have done this. And sort of like a list of many things, of shoulda, coulda, have to, sort of mentality. And I think it's I haven't really heard someone say that before, of having like this uncomfortable feel of looking at their work. And I think the more self-conscious you are about it, and the more emotionally um attached, in a way, because it's not just, okay, I'm at a beautiful figure and this beautiful sort of setting, and then I'm gonna leave it at that. No, it becomes more of a, this is a part of my life that was, a hard subject in it. I was going through things and all these different plethora of emotions, and now to constantly be reminded of that, it feels depressing. It feels like, now I've put it out there, and I constantly see it, and I don't want to be reminded of that. And coming back to the stonemason, having to look at that, having to look at these statues, because in the story, there's particular statues that you're going to be witnessing. These six statues in the middle of this room were statues that in his exhibitions people would come around and see them, and engage with them, right? And now that no longer is happening, that he's sort of shut down his doors and nobody's allowed there anymore, all those sort of comments and perspectives are echoing in his mind. And having to just go through my experience and apply that with him, and how his sort of life and his background and his thoughts, the only logical solution is to break things, right? To either break or recreate or something of that nature. And that's my conclusion with these six statues, is that some of them in the story, in the overarching story, is a memory of the past, is the memory when people could come in, and what they could see. But now, as you, the observer, going in and seeing what they're left, and sort of the state they're in, you get to understand, like, oh, so in this particular sort of section, there was supposed to be a boy statue with like A, B, and C description, and now I'm seeing this completely new thing. And on the floor, I'm seeing fragments of things, maybe a face of the boy, like, things like that. And I quite like that, because I'm sort of drawing a line between what is real and what is sort of an understanding of someone else's, that had nothing to do with the piece other than just witness it for an hour or two or 10 minutes or 20 minutes. So there's always like this romanticism between what it was and what is the reality of the situation. And it's something I've been feeling a lot in my artistic sort of endeavors, is that many people, when you're giving something out, when this question, this painting, this whatever, people will get it in their own way. They would feel attached, or they would feel a positive or a negative, or something along the lines that sort of mimics a short period of time that they engage with it. But to think about the creator who went through and actually spent time, months, years of or whatever, the amount of time they spend with it and the amount of time the viewer did doesn't match. So the romanticism that someone, either of the party or the complete different feelings that they might have, is fascinating to me. So the act of me introducing an overarching story and introducing reality at the same time, trying to introduce the actual story behind it and the actual mindset of the stonemason, is something that not only speaks to me, but I think it would speak to many. Because at the end of the day, whenever we want to create something, whenever we want to converse and explain what we felt, our answer is always sort of reaching the amount of third party words that we might be using. And to create a better explanation of this, is that at the end of the day, the words that we use are sort of reciprocating because it's a common language, right? Like someone can understand you, or vice versa, because you're using words that are to be understood. But when it comes to something that is a unique experience and you're trying to use this common language to explain it, the words that you're using is sort of a compromise. When you're feeling this sort of feeling, or this memory, this common language comes into play because you want to converse it, you want to share it, right? But in your mind, if you think about it, it's something very personal. It's something that sometimes, or at some point in your life, words couldn't complete to comprehend it, or it couldn't really describe it. But now, given that you want to cross that bridge, you compromise with it. Or either you spend your whole life finding your own words and sort of drawing people in and to understand, like, hey, this new word that I made means this. Or it's sort of like explored in this way that through patterns and repetition, you're able to detect and sort of understand that this means what the creator is supposed to make. And by having sort of in my mind not just the statue part, but also his words, his mindset, his environment, I think these are the perfect sort of array for someone to understand the actual meaning versus the, oh, I felt this behind this, and that should or might be the case. And having all these layers allows for what cannot be seen by by a normal circumstance of a viewer and an artist sort of creation. And that's the theme generally in this story that I'm creating. And to think that now the first arc, it's all about sort of showing a present sort of situation of the stonemason, or where he's at and what's happening around him. And the second arc, that is going to delve into his mind, which is a very recurrent theme of mine. The sheer sort of difference between these two topics of having to do with reality and at the same time his perception, we're going straight into his mind in arc 2, which completely shifts and changes everything in terms of what I was illustrating before. Because coming back to having consistency into my drawings, imagining the consistency in the environment, you get to understand, okay, this is a believable environment given that things are looking quite the same, but statues can differ as one painting from the next in X amount of days or months that pass between them. But in his mind setting, the design has to be so different for everyone to understand that this is something personal and at the same time fictional. And it's been playing into my mind this week, and I've been slowing down myself a lot. I've been finding new ways to create texture, new ways to create sort of all these different elements to allow myself to use them specifically to create sort of the environment that I want or the mood. And it's been fascinating, as all of this has. The more I think about how in depth this theme is going to be, the more I begin to sort of really reflect and say, okay, I need to really spend a good amount of time on this to create what I feel about this, the intensity that I feel. Because if we were to reflect this back to my streaming and painting years, I would create a painting, and with the next 3 4 months, I would consistently go over it and create it. And parts of it or moments of it, things will happen in my life, and I would feel sort of the urge to sort of like sit down and say, "Hey, this thing happened to me," and I need to reflect on it. But I kind of couldn't. I couldn't really do that. I had a emotion going, and I had to sort of complete it. But now that I don't really have that pressure and that sort of way of working, because it's a way of working, that's for sure. Like, not everything has to be done in consistency to see results. Consistency can be done in different and many different ways. Like, for example, now I'm putting a lot of consistency, but not in just one aspect. I'm putting consistency in how do I think about this, or how does this reflect with the other mediums of the art, like the writing part or the puzzle pieces, not just the illustration. And as I'm sort of slowing down, I'm able to see, okay, this design should inflict this sort of emotions, and this were the background of the stonemason, and how would I sort of either hit or at the same time introduce the overarching thing by someone witnessing this space, and all the objects that I put inside, how would they add to it or take away from it? How can I at the same time give something but then induce it with this new emotion that the actual composition doesn't inflict, but through this object that I just placed in this way and gave it this context, you begin to see it in a different light. It's it's ambitious. I keep saying, like, yeah, it's ambitious. I keep putting myself up and all these difficulty levels, and maybe in the end of it, it will be just something very basic, which I doubt. But sometimes our mind is giving us so much enthusiasm in something that we're really passionate about that sometimes we lack the ways to present it, which comes back to the point of how we feel and how we converse it with a common sort of language, a common sort of uh, communication form. It gets lost. So having so many layers, or sometimes fewer layers, I think will really set the stage for this story. But that's my thoughts on this week that passed. I have about 10% left of the drawing to create. I have a column in the back of the drawing and some tiles to shade over, because I found like this new shading technique that I liked. Well, it's not really a technique, it's just the motion that implies texture. And when you're implying texture in the background, you really need to be careful in not taking over in the foreground, which then I have to make sure that, okay, if the shadow is cast on the statue and on the back, there is like this silhouette of the shadow, then I have to blend this well. And then the texture that sort of like light hits on, we have to sort of show the roughness of the tile and things of that nature. In these previous designs, I didn't really do that a lot because I was like, okay, let's make things obvious. Foreground, background, smoother background, rougher foreground, that type of thing. You know, it's sort of like, if I were to give it in a simpler context, sharpness. The foreground will be much sharper than the background, and that's generally the idea. But when light comes into place and the way that the light casts on things, the background will inevitably have some sharpness. So considering that, and this coming week, this week that the log will come out, I will be working on finishing the drawing, which I think by Tuesday it will be done. Actually, probably by Wednesday. Yeah, and then I'll spend the rest of the week considering what's going to happen in the next three designs and sort of taking a break from the actual doing part of a new design and reevaluating myself. And I think that will really come down to an interesting log because I have been sort of reflecting as I go along. And I think in my logs you can hear me sort of like, okay, what happened in the past? But now I'm actually allowing myself time to really sit down on it and reflect. And if I were to take into consideration the months that were needed to create these redesigns, I have three more designs to do that are equivalent to the other statues on the opposing side. But then I have three major sort of the setting of each chapter of the first arc to do, which is a much bigger drawing. And I'm curious to see how I'll fare with those. So, yeah. Thank you very much for listening. I keep forgetting to say that in my logs, but I find it so mechanical to keep thanking and welcoming people. It feels like this should be and it's sort of an ongoing thing. And towards the end, I'll probably say, "Hey, thank you for listening." But I felt like saying it today, and I did. Regardless, I'm excited to see what the new week will hold, and I'll see what's in store.